My name is Allison Henline. I am the Education and Outreach Manager here at Shaker Historical Society. I am joined tonight by the one and only Quinn A. Hunter, who is going to be discussing her talk of Black Erasure in Historic and Contemporary Spaces. She recently did a show at the Praxis Fiber Workshop in Cleveland that was titled I Hear You Now, I See You Then, which was on display through February 28th. I believe that there is a virtual aspect to that is still available through Praxis Fiber Workshop, but double check their website and Facebook for more information on that. Quinn, a brief little thing about Quinn. She can definitely tell you more about her work and upcoming things, but she is a sculptor and performance artist from North Carolina, and she completed her MFA work at Ohio University. And now she works primarily with hair and African-American female body as material. Quinn is interested in the erasure of history from spaces and how the contemporary use of spaces impacts the way, sorry, I lost my place there, impacts the way we as a culture see the past, excuse me. Her work negotiates between the self and the world. Hunter's practice is contending with the false narratives of a romanticized past and interrupting them by laying a truth next to them. So tonight she's going to be talking about, again, Black erasure in historic and contemporary spaces. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Quinn herself. So take it on over, Quinn.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and to talk with you all about my work and my artistic practice. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a PowerPoint for you all. Okay. Oh, sorry, that is not the right way to share.
I think it might be under view. Yeah, there it is.
It's always different between Microsoft PowerPoint and Google Slides.
No, it's okay.
So, addressing Black erasure in contemporary and historic spaces. So who am I? I am Quinn Alexandria Hunter. I am a sculptor and I am a performance artist and educator. I graduated from Ohio University with my MFA in the year 2020, so last May during the pandemic. And then I got my BFA from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro in 2016. So again, I am an artist and a researcher, and my studio practice is heavily based in the research of Black history, specifically the erasure of Black bodies, either purposefully from records or lost due to time. So art and memory. I came to art at a very young age. I spent a large part of my childhood drawing, painting, and playing with various forms of clay, mostly air dry. And I can assure you that my very first artworks were like any other child's. I don't have innate skills, but it's a sort of a lot of hard work. And many believe that sort of artists are just sort of born with these innate skills, but I started making and I just never stopped. The place that I have come to is from hours of spending time working. And I want to emphasize that MFA and BFA degrees are research degrees. And I actually do not prefer the word talent. It negates the hard work that artists and makers put into their craft. And so I just really want to really take a moment and recognize the hard work of all of my fellow artists out there. And I see you and I see your work. So art for me is a language that begins to visualize where words start to fail. It allows me to meld together poetry and factual information. It allows the present to exist simultaneously at the same time as the past. Art allows cultural memory and the ability to layer beauty against immense pain. So for me, art makes memory and history tangible. So I want to start with talking about the project of Christopher Davis. So I moved to Athens, Ohio to start my MFA in the fall of 2017. So Athens, Ohio is a very small rural university town with a population of about 25,000, including the student population. And the population of the town is overwhelmingly white, at about 80%, with the Black population at about 5%. The program that I attended was about 3 years. So I really wanted to find myself in this space that did not look like me. I wanted to find connection to the land. So I started looking into the history of Athens. And I came across a lot that was positive and recognized by the town, including the Barry Motel, which is one of the first one of the first hotels owned by a Black man within the country. And also the Mount Zion Baptist Church, which is a really vibrant community of Black churchgoers that existed in the late early 1900s up through the mid 20th century. So each of these spaces were marked by a plaque and recognized by the town as part of their history and their demonstration of their tolerance for the Black population. And I came across these spaces really early on in my research. And I kept digging and I found the story of Christopher Davis in a series of articles printed by a Cincinnati newspaper. So Christopher Davis was a Black man that lived in Albany, Ohio, and he was accused of the rape and assault of a white woman. Upon his arrest, he was held in Athens, Ohio jail, where he was broken out and lynched by a white mob in November 21st, 1881. So I found this information by digging through some records and archives. And upon learning this information, I went to look for the site. I looked for a marker of the space and what had happened in that space, and I didn't find one. In fact, I didn't find a single acknowledgement from the university or the town that the lynching had happened in the middle of the center of the current university. That's the space was. And it's important to note that Ohio University was founded in 1809. And at that point, the university was well established in the town. So knowing this information, I couldn't not let Davis's memory and the circumstances of his death continue to exist in obscurity. And the university that stood on the land to continue to escape that acknowledgement. I decided to take it upon myself to write Davis's story back into Athens. And so with the help of my peers, this is the bridge that Davis was hung from by that white mob. And this is an image of that bridge in 1875. So just a few years prior to Davis's lynching. So knowing this information, I couldn't let Davis's memory continue to exist in obscurity. So I decided to take it upon myself to write Davis's story back into the story of Athens. So with the help of my peers, I designed and poured a bronze plaque and anonymously guerrilla installed it on the night of November 20th, 2017 in the space of Davis's lynching. The plaque stayed in place 19 months. And during that time, a local group, and this is an image of the plaque that I poured on Ohio University's foundry. And this is actually a marker via Google Maps of where the plaque was, and really is in the heart of Ohio University's campus. It is surrounded by the campus. But the plaque stayed in place for about 19 months. And during this time, the local group took notice and began the formal process of officially recognizing and getting an official state recognized marker. The marker was officially installed in late July 2020. And so the lynching of Christopher Davis is officially recognized by Ohio University and the state of Ohio now. And So all of these events actually played out over the span of 3 years when I lived in Ohio, and I unfortunately left Ohio right before the official plaque was installed in mid-July, so just a few weeks. But during this time, I began to look at other ways that history is erased from our contemporary world. And oh, sorry, here's another sort of standing plaque. And this plaque is actually now outside of the sort of student center on campus. So it's in a really prominent place. So I began to look at the way that history is erased from our contemporary world, and the Antebellum South became a strong reoccurrence. The history of the Antebellum South and the Civil War and the way that it's erased, rewritten, and romanticized over the past 150 plus years since its end. Slaveholders and their descendants have been working to sort of preserve and romanticize and sanitize the memory of the antebellum South since the close of the Civil War. They're actively working against history to rewrite and tell a story that discounts the lived horrors of the enslaved. This has been done through organizations such as the Daughters of the Confederacy, Civil War reenactments, Civil War monuments, plantation tourism, and textbook rewriting, particularly the prominent claim that the war was about states' rights. While all of this is happening, former enslaved and their descendants and white allies have been working to combat and preserve honest, unfaltering accounts of the cruelty of slavery and the inhumane system that it was. So through the recent years, the sanitation of the antebellum South and the Confederacy has been combated through monument removal, museum allocations, and land allocations. So actually, before moving to Athens, Ohio, I spent a year in Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy. So if you've ever been to Richmond, Virginia, or if you're familiar with Richmond, Virginia, there is a long stretch of road called Monument Avenue. This stretch of road is in the heart of Richmond, and it is home to 4 Confederate statues that are larger than life. I came face to face with these monuments at least once a week during my time in Richmond, and I physically had to navigate around them because they are so large. These monuments became the center of Black Lives Matter protests within the June and July of 2020 because they upheld white supremacy within a city that is actually majority Black. So the 3 of the 4 Confederate monuments have been removed, but Robert E. Lee's monument still stands. And when I see this monument, it really says to me, in a lot of ways, how could it have been so bad if we have monuments to this period? These statues really glorify and romanticize the Civil War and the antebellum South, and they color it in a way that they color the way we look and actively imagine this period of time. So having a sort of monument to this time period really elevates the time period in our sort of imaginations of how we exist and think about it. So this romanticizing is actually not just done through monuments, but it's also done through pop culture and film, and maybe most notably Gone with the Wind. So Gone with the Wind turned 80 in 2019, and it's still considered widely one of the best films ever made. After 80 years, this film has not been critically examined. I think about the public rituals that we as a society use to sort of perpetuate the sanitization of the antebellum South. So just to sort of talk about how this movie starts from the beginning to sort of sanitize this particular period of time. So the opening prologue there's this sort of poem that's super romantic that reads, "There was a land of cavaliers in cotton fields called the Old South. Here in this pretty world, gallantry took its last bow. Here was the last to ever be seen of knights and their ladies fair, of master and slave. Look for it in books, for it is no more than a dream remembered, a civilization gone with the wind." So you can see just in these few words that it's painting the antebellum South as a fairy tale. It's calling it a pretty world, ladies' fair. It's really coloring this time period as something not only to be remembered, but to sort of look up to sort of idealize for. And so I want to note that this particular film is actually the film that gave Hattie McDaniels and the sort of the first Black woman ever an Oscar. And so there exists these sort of dichotomies within this film of it romanticizing and glorifying, but also this huge barrier of an award that was given to a Black actress for the first time ever, and she died several years later. But this movie actually launched very recently on HBO Max, and when they launched it, they actually prefaced the movie with sort of a conversation about Gone with the Wind's sort of complicated legacy. But this doesn't mean that its romanticism doesn't live on in many ways. Gone with the Wind has deeply ingrained itself into our society in the past 80 years that it's been circulated. I remember the first time that I saw Gone with the Wind, I was in 4th grade, and it was played as a movie for us to watch in class. So the sort of indoctrination into this romanticism of the South happened incredibly early. I do want to note that I grew up in North Carolina, and so I was sort of born and raised in the South and sort of surrounded by, in many ways, monuments to the Confederacy. But Gone with the Wind has a really long-lasting legacy that impacts the way that we look at the architecture and spaces of that time, specifically plantations. So plantations are a huge draw, particularly for weddings and events. And these weddings are themed with Gone with the Wind, and that romanticizing of the antebellum South and sort of the fairy tale that is Scarlett O'Hara, which is the main sort of heroine of the story. By the way, Scarlett O'Hara is a horrible heroine. In comparison, she's incredibly bratty. And so, again, these are just a couple of sites that are really pushing the inspiration of weddings, particularly with Gone with the Wind, and sort of centering that movie as a pivotal romantic archetype, and sort of centering the bride as Scarlett O'Hara. And so I want to note that actually the Pinterest and the Knot pledged to stop promoting plantation weddings in the winter of 2019. I believe it was in December. But this doesn't mean that the content is no longer available on their sites. It just means that they don't actively promote it in the way that, that they don't actively promote it, but you can still find plantation venues on their site and book them through their sites. In fact, these screenshots I took for this presentation were 3 days ago. So this content is very much actively on their websites. And And so I want to talk about the erasure that has to happen in order for this site of grand historic pain to be converted into the space that thousands of couples have chosen to have one of the happiest days of their lives. So pictured here is actually Nottoway Plantation. Nottoway is a historic plantation. It is the largest plantation that is still standing. It is in White Castle, Louisiana. In the 1850s, it was actually a sugarcane plantation. If you know anything about plantations, you know that sugarcane is one of the most labor-intensive crops to grow. And so this site 150 years ago was a site that is much different than the one that is sort of being displayed now. So these sites have gone through extreme erasure to be used in this way. In fact, many of these sites are actually on the National Register of Historic Places, and there's documents that are free and open to the public that note the enslavement on the property. And so, in fact, because they're registered in the National Register of Historic Places, they actually get a tax incentive to make money off of these properties. So they're not only just erasing these properties, but they're actually gaining monetary value for it. And the government is sort of giving them money to sort of continue in this way. So this is actually still Nottoway Plantation. This is Nottoway Plantation, and an image that I have pulled from its actual documents from the National Register of Historic Places. These are actually the images that they used to submit Nottoway to get that designation. So again, this plantation didn't exist in this way. It wasn't just found in this way, it was restored and sort of converted into this sort of dream wedding venue. And it's also important to note that this is that it advertises itself as a resort, hotel, and bridal suite. So it is actively erasing. And so I started doing these sort of diptychs and collages that show the images and the information from Nottoway Plantation prior to its sort of conversion to this sort of romanticized space and place. And I in these sort of diptychs, I highlight the fact that they do know exactly what they're doing, that they do know that enslaved people were sort of born, lived, and died within these spaces. So I fade out the other information and really highlight that the other information, sort of bring it forward. So this particular document reads that by 1860, he owned 155 slaves and 6,200 acres, of which 1,200 were under cultivation of sugarcane. So the document, when it was filed in, I believe, the 60s or 70s, it is well known that this space was used to enslave African Americans. And so I did this with a couple different plantations. This plantation is the Twin Oaks Everhope Plantation. So it was known as Twin Oaks. It has been rebranded completely as Everhope Plantation in Alabama. And though this one doesn't specifically say how many were enslaved on the plantation, it does note that house slaves were, from what we know of landscape of servitude of the mid-19th century Alabama, presumably relegated to the peripheral spaces of the attic, kitchen, and 1 or 2 bedroom quarters in the service yard. So again, there's this acknowledgement. They know exactly what had happened in these spaces, and they're choosing to erase it. And they're choosing to use these spaces as wedding venues, as spaces for people to have these sort of happiest moments of their lives. And so in going through these documents and going through these records, I began to work on the project I Hear You Now, I See You Then. And so I'm just going to actually read the statement about this project. So this exhibition serves to uncover, evaluate, and challenge the erasure of the labor of enslaved African American women in the Antebellum South from the contemporary architectural spaces and landscapes. These art projects refer to luxury objects that were able to be purchased from the profit made from enslaved labor. Each of these objects is tailored to a specific plantation home and site that is using erasure to profit from these sites of historic pain. All of the sites referenced here are presently used as wedding venues. It is only through erasure that such a happy event can be held in a space of grand historic pain. It is also through my own labor in making that I am combating this trend. I use a material that is ingrained and socially connected to the Black body to make these objects. I am not only re-inscribing the history of enslaved labor back into these sites, but I am connecting the historic Black body to the contemporary Black body. So the exhibition, I Hear You Now, I See You Then, first culminated in the spring of 2020. It never opened to the public due to COVID, but I was able to sort of install and take images of this show. And the show actually was the show that was mentioned by Allison at the beginning of the talk that was actually in praxis. It came down just last weekend. So what you're seeing here is the culmination of this research representing 3 different plantations that are contemporarily used as wedding venues. So front and center is Nottoway Plantation. So the rug and chandelier reference the entryway and ballroom of Nottoway Plantation in White Castle, Louisiana. The rug depicts growing sugar cane, piles of sugar, cane cutters, and the leaves of the sugarcane plant. Nottoway is the largest standing antebellum home, and it is used contemporarily as a restaurant, resort, and wedding venue. And in the 1850s, it was a sugarcane plantation with over 150 enslaved. And so the process that I'm using to make these rugs and chandeliers is through hair braiding and latch hook. So the way that I'm making these is each individual loop is hand pulled through a matrix grid, and I actually have a picture of it later to show you guys. But each individual loop has been hand pulled through this matrix by my own hand. And for me, this labor is my own personal labor that I've used to meditate and think on and remember those that have been erased from the record, that's whose labor isn't valued, that's been erased from these spaces. And so in using my own contemporary labor, I'm combating the sort of continuous erasure that's happening from these sites. This is the bottom of that larger chandelier. So this is from Magnolia Gardens and Magnolia Plantation and Gardens that is in Charleston, South Carolina. This references the dining room and the carriage house of Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. And the rug depicts growing rice, harvested rice plants, piles of rice, and then the leaves of the plant itself. So Magnolia Plantation is over 300 years old. It saw both the Revolutionary and the Civil War, but it is contemporarily used as a museum and tourist attraction, as well as a wedding venue. But in 1850s, it was a rice plantation with 45 enslaved. And I do want to note that Magnolia Plantation and Gardens does acknowledge the enslavement of African Americans, and it actually has a tour that you can take that is separate from their regular tour that acknowledges the enslaved and the knowledge that they brought to the plantation of rice growing. The enslaved were the experts in that knowledge and actually taught their enslavers that knowledge. But Magnolia Plantation and Gardens is still holding weddings within this space. And because they're still holding weddings within this space, it is still a form of erasure that is happening because they're holding these sort of beautiful, romanticized events. And all of these are made with artificial hair integrations or hair weave that is been pulled through this matrix by my hand. And then the last that I'm going to show you is the Twin Oaks Everhope Plantation. So this rug and chandelier set references the hallway and the hallway within the upper level of the Twin Oaks Plantation in Alabama, and it depicts growing cotton. So Twin Oaks Plantation is actually a Greek revival plantation, and it's it's modeled after the Greek revival, and it's self-described as big, bold, and beautiful. But it's contemporarily used as a bed and breakfast and wedding venue. In the 1850s, it was a cotton plantation that enslaved 27 human beings. I actually want to note that if you know anything about enslavement, that the cotton, and particularly the cotton gin, was a incredibly brutal task. In fact, many lost their limbs, if not their lives, to the sort of mechanizing of the cotton gin. And so again, to have a wedding in a space that existed in such horror really is an erasure, really is a negating of a community and the descendants of that community. And so for me, this particular project really starts to talk about the erasure and really re-inscribing that labor back into place, and sort of reminding these spaces of their history. I've contacted all of these plantations, and they know that this work exists. I have not received any sort of notification back from them, but they are complicit in this erasure. They are complicit in ignoring the history and the foundation and the building blocks of this country that was on the backs of enslaved African Americans. And really, it is sort of through the Black female body that this country was built, because every human is sort of born a woman. Every enslaved being was the child of a Black woman. And so I really am impacted and interested in making sure that this history doesn't fall to the wayside, and making sure that these plantations don't continue to operate in this way without an amount of accountability. A great plantation a great example of a plantation that is doing it in a better way is actually Monticello. Monticello does not allow weddings or events to be held on their property. They exist solely as an educational museum, as well as several other plantations. And there is a movement that is holding plantations accountable. And there are just as many that don't allow weddings as there are that do. So this project is really about that accountability. And this project was nowhere near finished. I really hope to continue it throughout the rest of my sort of career as an artist and as a maker, to sort of really talk about what happened in these spaces. So, and then so you guys can sort of start to get a size or sort of a sense of the size of these pieces. They're extremely large. The largest one being 8 by 10 feet. And so they took sort of a lot of time and a lot of material to create. And so my current project that I'm working on is Paradise, the Myth of the Liberal North. So right now I'm actually working and living in Detroit, Michigan. And I'm working actually at Wayne State University, and I'm working on this project. And within this project, I'm working to create an exhibition that layers history, geography, and social relations, as well as the present together. I want to lay them next to each other and create an image that is not only wholly of Detroit, but of America, using Detroit as a point of study. So this work reveals the promise of Detroit that many Black Southerners sought during the Great Migration, and how the fallout of that promise has really led to Detroit as it is now. So I'm particularly looking at redlining, and particularly the mapping of Detroit's history through redlining and green lighting, through white flight, deinvestment, through the destruction of the historic Black Bottom and Paradise Valley neighborhoods in the name of progress. So what you see here is a screenshot of the map of Midtown Detroit. So the area that you see that's circled is the area in which the Black Bottom and Paradise Valley neighborhoods existed. They were a primarily Black neighborhood that was raised in the 1950s and declared a slum clearance in order to build the highway that you see now. In fact, the highway was planned years before, and the Black residents that owned businesses and homes within the neighborhood couldn't sell them after they had been sort of marked for clearance and that this highway was coming through. And so the residents lost any generational wealth or income that they had in those properties. And so I'm using this archival information to create a series of works and images that are honest and painful, that talk about the resilience and duality of living Black in a system that we were never meant to survive in. So I'm using these sort of images, found images that were taken right before Black Bottom was destroyed. The images that you see, the streets that are mentioned at the bottom, actually no longer exists. This was a complete obliteration of a neighborhood and a community and the wealth of this community. So there's actually no one event that can be pinpointed to that explains why Detroit is in the position that it is in. But so the work that I'm making doesn't attempt to sort of create a timeline of an overwhelming series of events. And in instances that created the conditions of Detroit currently, instead it seeks to contextualize them and the cause and effect relationship of the myth that brought Black Southerners to the North by the hundreds of thousands. And it's really talking about how Michigan really was considered the garden of the West, and how next to the destruction of Black infrastructure of the 1950s, and particularly Black infrastructure, and really the contemporary resilience of Black Detroiters in the way that they've created a community and aren't looking for a way out, but a way through. So that's really the project that I'm really interested in making, that I'm contemporarily working on now. The project will culminate in an exhibition in the next year or so. And I'm really excited about the work. I'm really excited with working in the community and sort of getting to know Detroit for what it is, and not the continuous sort of negative media attention that that is being sort of pushed onto Detroit. So I exist at a lot of crossroads, the crossroads of art and research. I exist at the crossroads of the present and the past. I exist as an individual, but as part of a community. I work in my studio a lot. This isn't my current studio, but this was the studio that I had before the pandemic. This is the image that I mentioned earlier, in which you can sort of see the matrix that I'm individually pulling the hair through. This image is actually so you have a reference for the size of the work. And so this is actually the 8x10. And this is an image that someone took of me after I had finished working on it after several very long months. This is a stack of books that I have in my studio. I do a lot of research. I'm sort of committed to basing my artistic practice in research and using that research to make the work that I make. Everything that I do is usually backed up by a statistic, a fact, and a purposeful decision that is based in that research. And then I just want to really emphasize that I am not an island. I cannot do the work that I do without the help of my friends, of my community. And I just want to take this moment to acknowledge them and their labor with me. So we are often asked to show up, to help out, to give what we can. I'm asking that we remember. Remembering is an active thing that we must do in order not to forget the past, and the way that we can sort of combat erasure together. As long as someone remembers, then we as a society will not forget. Thank you.
That was really powerful, and your work is so beautiful, first of all, but also the research that you've put in and the manifestation of all of this work and culminating in such beautiful pieces, I think is just fabulous. And it's like you said, it's beyond talent. It's just superb, and genuinely kudos on your show. And I can't wait to see the next installment of your work and your research. It's at this time that I'm going to ask everyone to maybe comment something, or if you have any questions for Quinn, please feel free to enter them into the chat or into the comment section. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to let anybody ask any questions that they may have or put any comments in. But first and foremost, I want to thank you, Quinn. Thank you for spending your time here on a Saturday night with us here at Shaker Historical Society. It truly means a lot to us to be able to have someone of your research and your caliber and everything that you do speak with us and for us here and to our members and to our community. So thank you very much for making your time available to us. So we greatly appreciate that.
It's been a pleasure.
And again, amazing and powerful work. Truly, when I watched the show, I watched the opening. I wasn't able to go and visit it in person of I Hear You Now, I See You Then, but truly, and I cannot emphasize this enough, but a powerful show, incredibly poignant for a modern era to consider where we go, what we do, and the labor and the history behind everything. I know it's easy for us, especially I'm from Ohio, I'm from Northeast Ohio. It's easy for us Northerners to kind of, forget about these histories or, as you say, the obliteration, the erasure. So I think it's important what you mentioned that, we continue to move forward and to remember and to call like a call to action and just to keep on doing what we need to do to make sure that this is at the forefront. I have a couple of things from Facebook coming in. Everyone is saying, it's amazing, a very powerful presentation, incredibly powerful work. Brianna asks, how much of your research is through community stories and memory rather than institutional archives?
The work that I've done so far that's been in particularly I See You Now, I Hear You Then was exclusively through archival research. I was actually able to talk on the phone with someone from Magnolia Plantations, and they were actually able to give me some information about the census records. But primarily my research for that particular project was in sort of archival information and sort of looking through microfilm. The current project that I'm working on now has a lot more sort of community involvement. I've been talking a lot with researchers. I'm actually in the middle of looking for anyone that would remember living in Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, because it wasn't that long ago that it was raised. We think of the 1950s as being a lifetime ago, and in many ways it was, but there are still people alive that lived in that community. And so I'm really looking and hoping to speak with them during the sort of culmination of this project. The pandemic has made it hard to get in touch with some of these people because they would be in their sort of later years and living in sort of either group or nursing homes or a sort of extended care facilities, most that have been closed to the public. But I'm very hopeful. I really want to make my practice more of a community-based practice, because it's much more fun to remember with someone else than just by yourself. Thank you for that question.
Of course, I think that, especially with community-based, I'm thinking off the top of my head, like oral histories. As you mentioned, a lot of the people that might have lived in those neighborhoods or remember those neighborhoods are now in their senior years, and it is incredibly difficult in a normal year to contact them. And I can't even imagine, what a pandemic has put on that already incredibly difficult situation. So I'm sending you all of the good vibes. So I hope that you get what you need and easily. But I'm not seeing any more questions. But again, thank you. I cannot say enough thank you for spending your time and sharing your knowledge with us and your work with us. It was incredibly powerful, and it is just amazing work to see. Oh wait, we do have one more question. It's from Belle Pillar. She says, thank you so much for sharing your work and process with us. But they're curious about the decision not to include more obvious visual trappings of the wedding culture. And I hear you now, I see you then. Was that something that you had considered given your extensive research? And a follow-up, how did you decide whether or not to include those elements?
Yes. So I did think about including wedding elements, but I ultimately made the decision not to include wedding elements because I wanted to be very clear about my feelings of sort of weddings in these spaces. And I felt that it could easily sort of be misinterpreted as a sort of a glorification of the weddings within the sites. But I did sort of, at the very beginning of the project, think about reaching out to these spaces as a potential client or bride to sort of be in the space, but ultimately felt that in putting sort of wedding paraphernalia within the space, that it would distract from the sort of true heart of the project and remembering the sort of Black enslaved that were erased from the space. And then the second part of the question, I decided on rugs and chandeliers because they were really considered luxury objects that were able to be purchased through the sort of monetary wealth that was made through the enslavement of those Black bodies. So the people that sort of worked the land and sort of cultivated the cash crops that were then turned into cash, then purchased sort of the expansion of the land, the larger than life plantations, the sort of grandeur, so that luxury is really tied to the Black bodies that made that money. And I really wanted to sort of emphasize that connection as well.
Certainly. We have another question from Bree, who says, I'm interested in how you consider the difference between public spaces, i.e. the bridge where you put the commemorative plaque in moments, etc., and those that exist as private capitalistic entities, such as plantations as wedding venues. Can you talk a little bit about the tensions there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess at a certain point, I stopped looking at plantations as private spaces. Because in a lot of ways they're operating as a business, and while they're privately owned in most cases, they're really open to the public. And so I think what was the first part of the question? The bridging between?
What you consider the difference between public spaces and those that exist as a private capitalistic entity.
Got it. Yeah, I think for me, the sort of Christopher Davis project wasn't about me. In fact, I think that this is the first time that I've sort of talked about the project publicly. It was done anonymously. And there's actually a really long story there, but it was done anonymously. And this is the first time that I'm really talking about it. And for me, that project was, in a way, forcing the community to remember Davis, and that he sort of lived, existed, and died in that space. And so for me, that project was about holding the community accountable for his memory. And then with the wedding venues, particularly the plantations, I look at the spaces more as an active erasure, versus the Davis being a sort of an erasure that has happened. But every time there's a wedding in a plantation, it's actively erasing the history even more. So in a lot of times it feels like someone's got an eraser to a piece of paper and they're just like continuously going at it. Like, I'm going to get through this piece of paper. It's not going to exist anymore, but it can't not exist. And so I guess that's really how I start to think about the difference between the public and private, but I really don't think of the institutions, the plantations as private, but I guess they are privately owned.
Well, that's definitely fair. I think that, if you're looking at it from that sort of perspective, I feel as though it's all the same sort of work. And especially as you mentioned, like the personal ties to it. I think we all kind of get into research, not just, we are personally interested, but it's not necessarily a personal story, I guess. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's just my perspective, but we have another question from Georgia who asks, do you know of any other lynchings that happened in Ohio, and how does that fit the narrative of Ohio being a free state?
Yes, I believe there are three other there are three lynchings in Ohio, I believe, that happened. I don't specifically know their stories, but you can actually find the information on, I believe, the ELJ, Equal Justice Initiative. They actually have a map of all of the lynchings that happened in America. And I think what really knowing that lynchings happened in the North, I think in a lot of ways starts to talk about accountability. There is this myth of the North being sort of a more liberal space because it was north of the Mason-Dixie line. And knowing that lynchings happened in the North and in Ohio really starts to talk about the accountability of being a free state, being that, yes, when enslaved crossed their lines, they were considered free, but that doesn't mean that they were free of discrimination, of incrimination, of being a Black human on American soil. It really starts to talk about personal accountability and the way that Black people start to move through space, and that bias has no boundaries. It's interesting in a lot of ways. I was born and raised in the South, and I've lived up north of the Mason-Dixie for 4 years now, and bias exists slightly differently here in a lot of ways. There's the, in the South, people will smile to your face and stab you in your back. That's like the cultural thing. But here it's hard to put your finger on, and it's a different way of existing. And I think that the sort of narrative that the North is more liberal just doesn't account for the fact that people have individual beliefs, and that we migrate actively. I've lived in North Carolina, Virginia, New York, Ohio, and now Michigan in my sort of short lifespan. And Ohio was free, but it wasn't free of bias and racial terror.
That's true. I think I will link in the comments after this, in the description of this, we will link all of the resources that you're talking about. So that way it is available. And again, just for anybody that is catching this late or has showed up to this live stream late, if you wish to watch the rest of this, it will remain on our Facebook for eternity, however long that is. And then we will also be posting it to our YouTube page as well. So if you missed any portion of this, it will be available in multiple different places, so that way you can watch it back. But I think that's kind of all the questions that I'm seeing right now. So I think it's best to kind of close it up, but I wanted to, again, thank you, Quinn, for sharing your time and your research and your work with us. It is incredibly powerful and I think poignant at every stage, like I mentioned earlier, it's important to, keep reminding ourselves of this work and to keep moving forward with it. And I can't wait to see what your next installation will bring. Just a quick thing, housekeeping. Next week we have our Praxis Fiber workshop, which will be happening on Saturday at noon, and that is for the Indigo Project. So if you might have seen it on Facebook, but if you're interested in that, make sure to tune in for that next weekend on Saturday at noon. And then that's kind of it for now, but I don't see any other questions. Everyone's just saying great job and amazing work to Quinn. So thank you again, Quinn, for your incredible presentation and for sharing your work with us. And without further ado, I think we're going to end it. So,
well, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed this.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your time with us again. It was amazing. So I'm going to end the live video now. Bye, everyone.